Okay, it's about 4 past 4, so in the interest of, in the interest of respecting everyone's time, we can get started. So thank you all for coming to this program hosted by the Shrewsbury Public Library. I think it's going to be a real treat. I've known Deirdre for a long time, and she's an extraordinarily talented musician. Although actually looking at most of these names, I think most of you have also known her for quite a long time as well. So I'm not telling you anything you are not already aware of. Like I said, we are recording this, so please do keep your video and your microphone off. We will have time. Deirdre had mentioned she'd like to leave a little time at the end for questions. Depending on the size of the group and the number of questions, I might come back to moderate those, so you can feel free to put questions into the chat as you think of them. If there's only a few questions, though, we can probably just have people unmute themselves and ask her directly. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Deirdre. And again, to make sure her video is front and center, just click on the little dots and do the pin video.
Okay, there I am. Good. All right, well, thank you for coming so far as one goes to anything nowadays. Before I start getting into the actual program that I put together, I figured I'd just start with a few tunes to make sure I still know how to play, and since you probably want to hear a few tunes to get us started. So here we go. So those were two tunes. The first one was The Day the Ass Ran Away. That is referring to a donkey. And the second one is called Sean Tibrid Oren, which is sort of like Tipperary John. Tibrid Oren is the original Irish for Tipperary. So today I will be talking about the history sort of Irish music and a little bit of Irish history and some language as well, some poetry and song lyrics. And I've never talked about these things all together at the same time, so this is a little new for me, as is the format where I can't read people's faces. So before we get into the history, I'm just going to tell you about the instruments I'll be playing today. The first instrument that you just saw is the flute, an Irish flute. And the Irish have been playing flutes really since probably just the 19th century. It's a later, or well, yeah, later addition to Irish music. They took the flutes that were cast off by others in Europe as musicians moved on to the modern flute that you'll be familiar with, the silver flute with all the keys. And Irish flutes can have more keys on them than this one. But again, it's a wooden instrument. This is Brazilian tulip wood, for anyone who's wondering. and wood is always temperamental. And the other instrument I will be playing today is another wind instrument. It is played differently. It's sort of played like a recorder. You're blowing into what you call a fiddle here. So like that, as opposed to blowing across. This is obviously the whistle. This is a fancier whistle than the traditional tin whistle. You can actually tune this thing, which is very nice for when you're playing with people. And there have always been whistles of some kind, you know, played for much of history. They found ones in Ireland from the Middle Ages, in a site in Dublin. How it was played, how it was tuned is another matter, but there's always been something like this. So those are the instruments that I'll be playing today. There are, of course, other instruments that you'll have seen in Irish music. The fiddle, which has been a long-standing traditional instrument for the past, I don't know, 300 or so years, probably 300, 400 years. The uilleann pipes are another traditional instrument dating to the 18th century. Pipes of some kind have been played in many societies for a long time, but the Irish uilleann pipe, which is a bellows blown bagpipe that you have to sit down to play, again, it dates to about 18th century. And then since that time, there have been other additions like the box, which is what the Irish call the accordion. That comes, you know, I don't know, late 19th or early 20th, concertina, melody, and then various strings, like the banjo and the bouzouki, which come from altogether different cultures. So to start with some of this history, I'm going to begin, I guess, with the sort of the time of St. Patrick, which is a bit of a cliche, I suppose. However, importantly, with the arrival of St. Patrick and Christianity in Ireland, you have the arrival of writing. And so we know more from that point on. And it has a profound impact on the culture. So the Irish begin writing in Latin. They create, you know, build many monasteries in Ireland. They go out to the continent. And then importantly, they begin to write in their own language as well, in what you call Gaeilge. Irish is usually how people refer to the language now, but it begins to actually be written down. It is the oldest vernacular in Europe. And for anyone who doesn't know, it's obviously it's Indo-European language, Celtic tree. There's a split in that tree. You have Welsh, Cornish, and Breton on one side, and then you have Irish, which eventually gives you modern Irish, Scots Gaelic, and Manx. So they begin writing in their own language. The society is an aristocratic society. People often want to think of Celtic societies as some kind of, I don't know, big group hug with everyone empowered. But unfortunately, it was not exactly that way. It was a decentralized society for the most part. It may have, towards the later Middle Ages, become more, or tending towards more centralization, but it was a largely, again, decentralized society. Now, again, it was an aristocratic society, and that society was very much propped up by poets and musicians, and particularly harpers. We don't know a whole lot about the other instruments or the music making of the regular people, who of course are always the bulk of people. But the poets functioned as sort of, I don't know, you could say propagandists for the Gaelic aristocracy, and the harpers would compose pieces, and that in honor of this aristocracy. And the Irish had a highly developed instrument, the clóirseach. And for anyone who's interested in more about harps, I would recommend looking up about Siobhan Armstrong. She is someone who has worked on playing reconstructed Irish wire-strung harps, which is different than the other ones that you see later. So that's sort of the shape of the society at the time. And again, so the music we know about is, you know, that it propped up that Gaelic order. We also know that it was important in a lot of the storytelling and what's documented in manuscripts, that music had power. So there was the sun tree that would put you to sleep, and the gown tree that would bring you joy, and the gold tree that would make you very, very, very sad. So music was viewed as a powerful thing. So moving on through that, though, I'm going to skip the Vikings for anyone who was hoping to hear about them, but they're just not quite important enough to the story. So I'll move ahead to 1169. Dermot MacMurrough, excuse me, was a king of Leinster, and he was chased out, as it were. And in order to regain his power, he enlisted help from the Anglo-Normans, and the Normans a century before had conquered England with William the Conqueror in 1066. Dermot invites them over, and that is the beginning of profound changes in Ireland, which are with us to this day. It's why some of us are here on this continent now, I guess. And that first period of the Anglo-Normans is not really all that bad compared to what came later. So the Normans have, on one hand, they have negative views of the Irish. There are these, I guess what you could call race laws that are put into effect to try to keep the Irish apart from the Anglo-Normans. However, the Anglo-Normans are very much absorbed into Irish culture. They find it sort of seductive in a way. And in fact, Gerald of Wales, who wrote about Ireland at the time, he goes on about how barbaric everybody is and, just absolutely disgusting. But he says the one thing that's really great about the people is their music. So the Normans, adopted a lot of Irish customs. Many of them adopted the language, wrote in the language, played the music. And to sort of lead into our next piece, one of those aspects of Irish culture that they adopted was something called the Culan or Kulen, which was a hairstyle. I think it's a hairstyle, not a hairpiece. I believe it was a hairstyle. And one of the kings of England, Edward I, had issued some kind of statement. I don't know English law, so I'm not sure the right term here. But anyway, it was telling the English in Ireland to stop wearing their hair the same way as the Irish, because it was getting them killed, because other English soldiers were mistaking them for Irishmen, and so they were ending up dead. So they needed to stop wearing this hairstyle if they wanted to stay alive. So to use that as kind of a segue, there is an Irish tune, there's a song, slow air, various terms, that is very well known, and it's called Unkulen. Now, I want to be very clear, it is not connected to this medieval hairstyle. Some people long ago tried to claim that it was. It is not. It refers to a fair maiden. Cool can actually refer to your hair, so it might be like a fair-haired person, but came to mean fair-haired maiden. And again, it's one of the most popular slow airs. It has had many different sets of lyrics set to it. It's appeared in many manuscripts, although it's first probably documented in the 18th century. The tune could be older. Maybe it could go back as far as this period, probably not. But it is a storied piece. And one of the things about it is that it's a love song, and it's praising this young woman. And so the Normans are credited with bringing in sort of courtly love traditions into Ireland. Those traditions where the woman is absolute perfection, the man is pining horribly, and that kind of thing. So first I will play the air on the flute, and then we'll go through the lyrics to it. So, this is Unkulen. So that is the melody to the Kulen. There's probably variations on the melody, as there often is over time in different geographies, but that is a pretty standard version. So now I'll read to you the lyrics, or at least some of the lyrics here. And what I usually do with Irish language presentation is to read a little bit of the Irish and then the English translation and go back and forth. And just one thing I feel like I need to mention, the lyrics here refer to Deirdre, the mythological Deirdre. I did not choose this because of that. It just happens to be. So it's a reference to to Deirdre of the Sorrows. It's one of those lovely Irish stories where everybody's dead at the end. Okay, so Unkulen. The vec fossa Unkulen, she ag shul na boire. If you were to see the fair maiden and she walking on the road, dul balach na chulchil, san drucht le na broga, going along the path to the backwoods and the dew on her shoes. Ma vron she ma vroni, is nilt nu aki la hoige. Alas, she is my love, and she desires no youth. Skodug she bar muncha chog an fola, since she surpassed all Ireland in good manners. Is lunrach, is perlach, and vaijin hue and heavy, radiant and pearly, the fine quiet maiden she, is royesha le neachint and the skev and chanairi. It's so lovely to see the sunrise in her form. Saul de Deirdre, a man is a vrohacht, like Deirdre in mind and beauty, mar hilse le eg airi, nu realte ich morta, like the light of day dawning, or stars on a March night. So those are some verses from Unkulen, with the romantic traditions somewhat influenced, maybe, by the Normans. It wasn't all bad. All right, so moving on in time then. So we have a dividing mark, I guess, really in the 16th century with the 1500s, because the Tudors come on the scene in England. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with Henry VIII, his penchant for chopping his wives' heads off, and his having brought the Reformation to England. And unfortunately, another thing that the Tudors are responsible for is major changes in Ireland, which are why the country I suppose is the way it is today, why many of us are on this side of the Atlantic. And so you had beginning, particularly with Queen Elizabeth I, you have the Munster Plantation. So this is when you've heard maybe in some of the societal upset of late here, the term settler colonialism. This is England's kind of first real trial with this in a country overseas, which Ireland is overseas from England. It's not a long overseas, but a little bit overseas. And so you have the Munster Plantation, you have rebellions against this attempt to plant the country. You have 9 Years' War. You have a very high body count, particularly among the native population of Ireland, as well as it's maybe important to say that the Normans became the Old English, and so many of those Old English allied themselves with the Gaelic Irish at this point. So people whose names are, I don't know, Fitzgerald, Fitzsimmons, Burke, a lot of those names are Old English names. So at the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, or towards the end of her reign, you have the Battle of Kinsale. So Kinsale is now a nice touristy town on the southern coast of Ireland, but it's sort of where the world was lost in a way. You had the fall of the Gaelic aristocracy. So under the Tudors had been encroachments, destabilization, but at that point, the native power of Ireland was broken. And English power comes into play more or less throughout. You also have in 1607 then what's known as the Flight of the Earls. So several of the Gaelic chiefs, lords, they left Ireland then for the continent. They were trying to go to Spain, landed in France by accident, and made their way to Rome, where they apparently died from the weather in Rome, which is a little sad. And then the 17th century is another really bad century for the Irish. You then have the Munster Plantation wasn't very effective. It was kind of a bloodbath, but it wasn't very effective at planting the country. But then under starting with James the First there, the Stuarts, and then through the Cromwellian era, you have the Ulster Plantation, and the Ulster Plantation was successful at bringing people over and planting them. So, and that's, for anyone who doesn't know, the legacy, is the was, I guess, the troubles that went on for decades in the north of Ireland. So, Ulster Plantation. Then you have the Cromwellian period, where the Irish had rebelled against the plantations, and then there was lots of propaganda against them, and that propaganda saying, how vicious they were and how many people they'd killed. This was used as justification for Cromwell's invasion of Ireland, and that was a really devastating invasion that some historians have likened to being on a par with, say, the Nazi invasion of Germany. It was a huge population loss, and this is why that name, the name of Cromwell, is so kind of blackened in people's minds if they're of Irish descent. So during that time, the native Irish were kind of driven further and further down. There was huge land confiscations. So you go from, Irish people, maybe Irish aristocracy owning land, to having their land confiscated and given to settlers. So it's massive land shifts as well. And with that collapse of the Gaelic order, you also had a collapse in the status of those people who had propped it up that I mentioned earlier, the poets and the musicians. So the poets are writing really bitter poetry at this time, and a lot of them, as well as the Harpers, are, you know, sort of having to hit the road. So that's going to bring us to our next interlude here, of Turlough O'Carolyn, which is a name you've probably heard of. He lived between 1670 and 1738. So that places him after Cromwell, sort of during a slight period of respite, but then you have the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and then penal laws. So it continued in a bad direction for people like O'Carolyn. However, he is one of the few individual musicians for whom we have a large corpus of work. He left more than 200 tunes. They're scattered in different manuscripts, but people have worked to bring them all together. That doesn't mean that there weren't other people doing as much, but it just wasn't documented. So we should be thankful for that body of work. Now, he's considered one of the last Harper composers, and in a sense he's one of the last few who lived kind of in the old way, which is with patronage. So again, poets and the Harpers had patrons depending on that Gaelic aristocracy. So he was able to survive sort of on the remnants of that Gaelic aristocracy. He was born in Meath. He spent most of his life in the Roscommon Sligo border country. He lived largely on the largesse of the McDermott Rowe family. He was blinded with smallpox at 18, and he was taught the harp and then sort of sent out to make his way with his music. And so he composed for anybody who would take him. So he would compose for what they would at the time call for, you know, Gaeilge and Gael, meaning for native Irish and for foreigner. He was also reputed to be, I guess, a bit of a brawler sometimes, despite being blind, and a lover of kind of, you know, whiskey and women, that kind of thing. And when he died, he was waked in that same border country, in Roscommon, Sligo border country, for 4 days. I believe his body was brought out on the 5th day. People came from out of town and stayed in Ballyfarnan, and apparently the poor people were out in the fields with kegs of whiskey. So it was a very lush, I guess, celebration of his life and work. So we are going to, well, I'm going to play for you 2 pieces. The first one is called Carolyn's Quarrel with the Landlady, and there is no story explaining what happened between O'Carolyn and his landlady. But again, he was prone to brawling. So that could be the explanation right there. And the second piece is called, yes, Henry McDermott Rowe, who was a member of the McDermott Rowe family, again, the ones who were his patrons. So this is 2 tunes by O'Carolyn. So those are 2 O'Carolyn tunes there. So, excuse me 1 second. It's a little warm in here. continuing on from there, the next selection we'll have in Irish is from later in the 18th century. So Carolyn died in 1738. And the piece that we'll be going through is from 1773. So again, this is sort of period of the penal laws. People are sort of struggling to get by as best they can. So the piece that we'll be going through is a very famous one. It's called the Clina Art Wi Lire. So it's the keen or lament for Art O'Leary. Now, Art O'Leary was an Irishman who went off to the continent of Europe to fight in the armies there. So a lot of Irishmen, or those who could, would go off to the continent, thinking maybe opportunities would be better. So he was with the Hungarian Hussars, and he came back to, I think this was in Cork. He came back to Cork, and he had a very nice horse. And at this time, under the penal laws, as an Irish Catholic, you're not supposed to have a horse that, I think it was a horse that's worth more than £5. And then if a Protestant settler, whatever part of the ruling class, wants that horse, you have to sell it to them or relinquish it. I'm not exactly sure of the exact wording of the law, but basically you had to give up your horse to them. So Art O'Leary had this horse, and there was this magistrate, Abraham Morris, and he was, again, so he's a magistrate, he's one of the Protestant settlers. He sees the horse and he wants it, and Art O'Leary refuses to give Abraham Morris his horse. So Abraham Morris has Art O'Leary declared an outlaw, and he has a troop of soldiers hunt Art O'Leary down, and on May 4th of 1773, Art O'Leary is shot down, and apparently the horse then trotted home, and his wife saw the horse with the blood on it from Art's unfortunate end. So the Lament for Art O'Leary was supposedly composed by Aileen Dove Wichonel, and that was his wife. And she supposedly composed this extemporaneously, which may sound strange to us now, but there was a tradition of composing extemporaneously. So people, there were certain, maybe stock phrases or stock patterns you could rely on, and then you could be creative within that. But there were, things you could fall back on for that. So it's not as strange as it may sound to us now. And also, just to note, that keening was very much a woman's kind of work. So women often were the ones who did this. So she supposedly composed this extemporaneously at the time. How it was documented and passed down after that, I'm not sure. So it's actually a very long piece. I'm going to be just reading some excerpts here. And the first little verse, usually I go back and forth sort of 2 lines or something like that. I'm going to just read the first verse in its entirety in Irish, just so you can hear a little bit of the rhythm, and then I'll translate, and then I'll take it more normally from there. So this is the Clina Art Wi Lire. Machrá go dangan tú, lá do vacahu, a county an vargi, hug ma hiúl arachit, hug ma crí tatnav ditch, they lia some charad lat the wa the walya lat. My steadfast love, the day I saw you at the market house, my eyes were drawn to you, my heart glowed for you, I fled my friends with you, far from home with you. Is dúsa nor bharach. For me, there was no regret. Chorish parlús á dhealachum, Rómana á mrachachum, You had a parlor painted for me, rooms arranged for me, bacchus o yargachum, briki o gyapachum, the oven glowing red for me, loaves readied for me, rosta varadum, mart o lagachum, roasts on the spit for me, cattle slain for me, culla glúv lachandum, go diag an tadarha, no harish da datnaglum, sleeping and duck down until late morn or later if I liked. Machara go dangan tu. His quibin la magna, an law bra ari ood. My steadfast friend, I remember that fine day in spring. Gur vrá hiag hatachich, fui vanda or taringhe. Your fine hat with the gold-drawn band. Cleave keen adagit, law vias chalma, the silver-hilted sword, your fine strong hand. Ram sol vagarhach, fear chre agla, or noyage chelgach. The menacing movements, the quaking of treacherous enemies. Tu igor chun falaracht is ach quail cannon foot. You ready to ride the slender white-faced horse. Dovlidish Sassani shisko talavdich. The Saxons bowed down to the ground before you. Isni vahalat ach lehen corp agla. Not for your sake, but with sheer terror. Kegor loa kayachtu, a vornin vanama. Although it was they that killed you, beloved of my soul. Macharahu goldangan. Is nur hokag chul mawalya. Conchor biog and chana is Pharaoh Leary and Lanav. My steadfast friend, and when they come home to me, Connor our little love, and Pharaoh Leary the baby. Fi Freud Giam Gotapi, Korog is an nahar. They will ask me quickly where I left their father. No se doi fui varg, Korog as a gil na martyr. I will tell them in sorrow that I left him and killed the martyr. Glepid shia dar an nahar. Is ni ve sheaku, the fraggart. They will call for their father, and they will get no answer. So that is the Queen Art Wheelery. And again, it's considered actually one of the best pieces of Irish language poetry, or at least traditional Irish language poetry. So, moving on from there, try to lift our mood a little bit. It's a little depressing there. Not that it gets that much better for a while in Ireland. It's a bit of a rough millennium. Musically, most of what we think of now as traditional Irish music, most of it, first of all, was composed by anonymous. So the Carolyn tunes we talked about earlier are sort of an exception. A lot of it we don't know. Some of it we do, but a lot of it we don't. And most of it dates to the 18th and 19th centuries, and then there are more tunes added in the 20th and in the 21st century. So it's the past 300 years or so that this music comes from. So after that period that we're in, so that was the 1770s, so it's, you know, contemporary with the American Revolution here, you had other events in Ireland like 1798 rebellion that was partly inspired by the American and French revolutions, but it is important to understand that importantly, many of the people who had prominent roles in that were from that settler community, but they'd embraced a kind of, I don't know, ecumenical republicanism. So they were sort of major driving force in 1798. Some of the Gaelic Irish were just looking for any opportunity to, you know, get rid of the oppressor who, you know, did things like shot Art O'Leary for his horse. So you have the 1798 rebellion, and then the first half of the 19th century, it seemed almost like things were getting a little better. They got a little better for a few people. You had Catholic emancipation, although there's other sides to that, according to some historians. But things were getting a little bit better for some people, for those who could navigate the English-speaking world, perhaps in particular. However, then in the 1840s and into the early 1850s, you have the famine in Ireland, when the potato crop failed, well, maybe not most, vast majority, a large number of people were dependent on the potato for their sustenance. And so when it failed, they didn't have other options, and the government thought it would make them dependent if they were given other options for food. So that's the beginning then of Ireland losing so many of its people, which continued, through the 1980s, really. So, but despite this, people want to have some enjoyments in their lives, so they play music. And one of the things is that despite so much culture being lost because of the language loss that happened over a couple of hundred years, because of, the upending of the social order, people displaced from their homelands. But despite that, there was also some new creation in that, and the dance music is part of that. So the forms of dance music that we know now are from that kind of interaction between cultures. So we'll start with 2 jigs, and jigs are the oldest dance music form. It's not exactly clear where they maybe came from, but they're documented earliest in the written evidence. And again, this is a tradition that not only written by anonymous, but it was largely passed down person to person. So I'm going to play 2 jigs now on the whistle, and the first one is just called Jig. It probably has a name, but I got it from my whistle teacher years ago, and I have no name for it. And the second one is a better known piece called Contentment is Wealth. All right, so that's an example of jigs. And for those who don't know, these different dance music forms are distinguished by their rhythm. So you have the thank you, Amy. You have the jigs that are basically in 3. So you take a beat, which is just a kind of steady beat, and divide it in 3. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And next we'll go on to reels, where you take it and in the case of reels, you divide it into 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Jigs have a little more swing to them, and they're sort of related to, say, like waltz time 2, which is in 3/4. So it's a different feel when you're going between 3 and 2. So reels are considered a Scottish import. So again, some of that cultural exchange. Ireland and Scotland. Scotland's history is interesting, and I don't have time to get into it, and you probably don't want me to. But it has some cultural overlap with Ireland and the Gaelic west of Scotland, but then other aspects of it which are very different history and culture and traditions. So the first tune is Mason's Apron, which is probably originally a Scottish tune and has traveled around and has many different forms, and this is just one form that I learned on the whistle at one point. And the second tune is the Gaeilge, which I don't really know much about, other than it was a tune my whistle teacher gave me years ago, which I only learned more recently. So. So those are some reels. And then related to the reel, but a little bit different, are hornpipes. So the hornpipe is considered an English import, and it's similar to a reel, except you tend to play it, it's same, time signature, but you play it with a slightly different emphasis, a little more swing. So I'm going to play two hornpipes, the Garden of Butterflies and the Humours of Ballyconnell. A lot of hornpipes, in my opinion, in Irish tradition can have a slightly, I don't know, sort of insipid sound. So these are two that I like because they're a little bit different than some of the others that get more airtime. All right. Right, so those are some hornpipes. Let's see, 8 minutes. Um, yeah, I think I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit here in the interest of giving you a chance to ask some questions. So I'm gonna skip ahead to a concluding Irish language piece from I don't know, some point in the past 20 years. So the music, as you may well know, is going strong. It, despite the setbacks of the 19th century, which were considerable, despite immigration and all that, that the musicians ended up coming over here and doing recordings in the early 20th century. Despite all that, the music had a revival really starting in the 60s, probably with the Clancy Brothers, and then so on from there, the Bothy Band in the 70s, and it was off and running. And it's the popularity of the music, it's spread around the world to many unlikely places, even where there's not a large Irish diaspora. So the music's going strong, both in terms of sessions being played. Well, maybe not with everything being shut down lately, but with people playing in sessions, as well as performers who travel the globe. There are, of course, issues with that. Commercialization and all that with the music is another subject. The language, though, has not fared as well. Irish is considered an endangered language, according to an international body whose name I forget, but I believe it's associated with the United Nations, a group that kind of studies these things and puts out information on it. And that largely means that despite the fact that it's the first language of Ireland, despite the fact that it's taught in the schools, it is not really being passed down intergenerationally, which, as I like to say, means mothers screaming at their children in a language. That's what you need for a language to survive. So I chose a piece that I thought sort of encapsulates that as a finishing Irish language piece. And it was written by a poet, Gaeilge MacLachlan, who's from Belfast, born in Belfast in 1967. And Belfast is actually one of the few places where there's been something of a revival of Irish that may have some legs to it among the Catholic community in West Belfast. So this is a poem called Astrachain, which means translations. And in the poem in Irish, he uses a little bit of English. So you'll hear a little bit of English in the Irish, but it's not me translating yet. So I thought this would be an interesting note to conclude the little language portion on. So Astrachain. Ní astrachain a chlasí sivanach de cháirde, mé astracha áthracha is cuéilethe, le hiisce éirithe an bhéirle, a dhéanag límanóid húlínach, a díon derek ma chuid filiachta. No translations will you hear tonight, friends, translated, altered, and diluted with bubbly English that would make sparkly lemonade from the red wine of my poetry. Ní bhé mé astracha a nacht. I mean, like, cad chuige a bhfuil mé anse a chorbe. I will not be translating tonight. I mean, like, why am I here at all? An ag seo an fashion is ora. Léamh dá hangach, poetry, as Gaeilge. An ag bhfuil an saoil ag athrú, ní féidir a bheith cínte. Is this the latest fashion, bilingual reading, poetry in Irish? Is the world changing? It is impossible to be certain. Amana airian tú tarsach de chrúsa falsa nacha. Sometimes you grow tired from the lazy Irish ears. Féin sásamh an monoglot, a derlat. It sounds lovely. I wish I had the Irish. Don't you do translations? Self-satisfied, the monoglot tells you, it sounds lovely. I wish I had the Irish. Don't you do translations? Iad ag stánag orm go mór hiúlach, mar stánag ein cur a churin míchampór de chanól orthe. Them staring at me wide-eyed, like they're staring at an oddball, making them uncomfortable. Iad sásta go bhfuil sé hart, sásta go bhfuil an fila béirle ag teachta ma dhia le cúpla scéal green na churig réiteach an snag seasaníche. Them happy when it's over. Happy that the English poet is coming after me with a couple of funny stories that will smooth over this bump in the evening. Agus seo ina segwin. Lena chuid kaintse cafe culture is Seamus. And here he is for us with his talk about cafe culture and Seamus. Seo le cruthú dóibh go bhfuil siad lehanaganta is cultúrtha. He proves to them that they are broad-minded and cultured. Go diggin siad an pictar mór, go diggin siad filiocht. Seán is sé. That they understand the big picture, that they understand poetry. Here he is now. Agus sin mise an siúd how le méanar a gár néil ma chroma. And that's me there all alone in the corner of my woe, ag stána go héadvar, Olta Ian Rua ma chuid filiochta, staring jealously, drunk on the red wine of my poetry. Ma chuid filiochta Gaeilge, nor hig aine, my Irish poetry that no one understood. So that is Astrachain by Gaeilge MacLachlan. And I had one little piece of music I was going to play at the end before questions, so I'll play that now, and then I'm happy to stay for questions. And this is a piece called Port Nabooki. It's fairly well known now, I guess. It's an air, and it was supposedly learned by a fiddler one night on the Blasket Islands. He went out and he heard a lament from the fairies. The fairies were lamenting one of their own as they brought the body to the island. So there is often in the native tradition a belief that the fairies could impart music to you, give you musical talent, or give you a tune itself. So this is Port Nabooki, which means Song of the Fairies. All right, so um, that was the final piece I had planned. I know it's 5 o'clock now, um, but I'm happy to take questions, however we should organize that. Um,
Well, thank you, Deirdre. Do you want people to put the questions in the chat and I can moderate, or do you just want people to unmute themselves and they can ask you directly?
I'm fine either way. If one way is less chaotic, I'm happy to take advice on that.
Okay, sure. All right. Yeah, why don't people put questions in the chat and I can moderate if you have any questions. While we're waiting for people to take a few minutes to do that, it feels odd to describe a presentation that involved genocide as fun, but it was a really fun, interesting tour of kind of the Irish history of music.
Well, you're all very welcome. Unfortunately, talking about anything with Irish history, um, if you're going to be honest, you can't get away from
Yeah,
the things that happened, and when they were very bad, a lot of them, um,
yeah.
a lot of consequences, not just for Ireland, but really for the world. The British ended up with a massive empire, and it started there. So,
Yeah, yeah. There is somebody, I don't think it's a question, but there is what looks like an exclamation in Irish in the chat.
oh
I'm
yes,
not going to try to.
thank you. So,
Are there any? Do we have any questions? If not, we can certainly wrap up. Um, yeah, the general consensus seems to be gratitude. Right, I'm sure you can see it in the chat too. Here. Oh, actually, no, there's one from David Petty. Um, Patrick was the 5th century. Is there Irish music from that far back?
not to my knowledge, is there any documented music from that far back? The other thing was that the Harpers, and again, there's probably music done by other people, but they were the ones who were mentioned in historical sources, but they had an oral tradition. They didn't actually write down their music. So what's interesting is that their music, what of it we know, was only written down like at the end of the 18th century, I think, with the convention in Belfast of Harpers, and Edward Bunting and his documentation. And that's at the point where that tradition, like, basically was dying. You had a few old Harpers, and it was gone by the beginning of the 19th. So yeah, so it wasn't documented, unfortunately. So
Any other
when did the music expand beyond Harper's? I don't know. That is the correct answer to that. I mean, there was probably always um, music being done by regular people, some kind of wind instrument, is something that has existed throughout human history. Bagpipes are a long-standing instrument, um, but the music that is documented, we don't have documented music for the earlier period. We know the Harpers existed. Then, I suppose you begin to see documentation of traditional Irish music really in the 18th century, maybe a little bit before then, 17th maybe. Yeah, 17th and 18th centuries in some manuscripts. And then you have antiquarians collecting in the 19th century. So by the time it's being written down, it's probably been established for a while. But I don't know. We don't know exactly when these tunes come from. We can sort of guess, but we can't be certain.
Okay. Oh, yep, there's another one. Are there different regional kinds of music within Ireland?
Yes, there are different regional kinds of music. As anyone who plays Irish music will know, Kerry people like polkas, and I know other people who really don't like polkas. Um, but yeah, there's certain maybe dance forms that might be a little more popular in one than the other. Certainly, polkas would be an example of that. There are differences in style in terms of ornamentation or less ornamentation. You find the same differences within the vocal traditions, within the sean-nós, which is it's called like old style singing, a term some people object to, but there's differences in terms of the ornamentation in that. Yeah, so there are differences in the regional styles. There'll also be selection of repertoire as well. One thing though is, really with that second half of the 20th century and continuing on now, you have more homogenization because of recording, because of people moving more. So some of those regional styles are, threatened, or one will take over. It's the same thing with the language too. You have regional dialects, but media is causing them to kind of blend a bit more.
Okay. Oh, there's if you get a chance to look at the chat, there's a
Yeah, I
lot.
have it open, and
Long.
I'm watching it for any
Yeah.
questions.
Um, okay. If there aren't any other questions, we'll wrap up for tonight. Well, again, thank you, Deirdre. Thank you for, as somebody just said in the chat, thank you for sharing your talents and your knowledge with us tonight. We certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Actually, I'll put something in the chat here myself. If anyone has any other questions for me or wants any information on learning more, you may contact me at this email address. I don't mind. Um, it's my public email address. So yeah, you're welcome to get in touch with me if you'd like any direction on anything related to this evening's topics.
And as soon as I get around to editing this to to chop off the quiet beginning, we'll have this up on the Shrewsbury Public Library's YouTube page as well. So if anybody wants to look at it again or share it with people, you can feel free. Okay, that's it. So thank you for coming, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you again at future programs.
Thank you.